Hello, everyone. Welcome to Chapter 6. In Chapter 6, we're going to be talking about the bone and the skeletal tissues. So, the first thing I'll say is human skeleton consists of just cartilage, which is replaced by bone, except in areas where you sort of require flexibility. So, as a fetus is developing, we have a lot of cartilage, and then over time it's replaced by bone. And of course, we still have some cartilage in those areas of flexibility. So skeletal cartilage is made of mostly this highly resilient molded cartilage tissue that consists mostly of water. It contains no blood vessels or nerves. Basically, what we call the perichondrium is a layer of dense connective tissue surrounding the cartilage like a girdle, and it helps resist this outward expansion. And it contains these little blood vessels for this nutrient delivery. Cartilage, of course, is made up of chondrocytes, cells that are encased in small cavities that we call lacunae within this jelly-like extracellular matrix. There are three types of cartilage. We have haline cartilage, elastic cartilage, and fibrocartilage. Haline provides a lot of support. It is the most abundant type. You see these in things like joints and the articular, like the joints, the costal, the respiratory, like the larynx, the nasal cartilage, the nose tip. We also have this elastic cartilage. It's similar to haline, but it contains this elastic. You can see these in things like the epiglottis and the ear. And then, of course, there's fibrocartilage. That's these thick collagen fibers. They have this great tensile strength. And you see these in the menisci of the knee, the vertebral discs, and so on. So this, of course, is the bone and cartilage of the human skeleton. Of course, make sure that you're reviewing each of those. You can see the colors associate with different aspects of bone or cartilage. So you see this darker orange is this axial skeleton, and then this lighter orange color, tan color is the appendicular skeleton. And then the colors that are like blue, green, and red, they represent cartilage. And of course, blue is this haline cartilage, this green that you can see, of course, like right here. That's that elastic cartilage. And then we have some red in there too. That is sort of that fibrocartilage that we talked about, those thick collagen fibers that you see. So make sure you review all of that too. Now, cartilage grows in two ways. We have appositional growth. That means the cartilage-forming cells in the perichondrium secrete a matrix. And then, of course, this matrix lay down on the surface of the cartilage. We also have interstitial growth, and that's chondrocytes within the lacunae. And they divide, and they secrete a new matrix, and that new matrix is made within the cartilage. So when we are talking specifically about bone, there are seven important sort of functions of bone. First, the one that's probably the most obvious is protection. It's support for body and soft organs. And then, of course, there's protection. Protects the brain, the spinal cord, vital organs. Also for movement. It helps as levers for muscle action. So basically, it helps us be able to utilize those muscles. Another one is mineral and growth factor storage. That's calcium and phosphorus and growth factors. This is a reservoir for those things. It helps with blood cell formation. That's hematopoiesis. Basically occurs in the red bone marrow cavities of certain bones. It also helps with triglyceride storage. It's stored in some bone cavities. And, of course, some hormone production, like osteocalcin, which is secreted by bones, and it helps regulate insulin secretion, glucose levels, metabolism, and things like that. There are 206 named bones to the human skeleton, and they're divided into two groups. You heard me say these two groups in that picture of the skeleton. We have the axial skeleton, which is that long axis of the body, the skull, the vertebral column, the rib cage. And we also have the appendicular skeleton. And that's bones of the upper and lower limbs, the girdles attaching the limbs to the axial skeleton. So those are the two main groups of bones that we talk about. And so you can see here, this is just that image again of that cartilage and bone on that human skeleton. It's a little bit closer, so up close so you can see it a little bit better in this image, looking at both the axial skeleton in that darker orange and the appendicular skeleton in that tan. And of course the cartilage are also noted there as well. We also classify bones. So basically, we can classify them according to shape. So bones are classified into one of four shapes. We have long bones. Those are longer than they are wide. And those tend to be things like the limb bones. We also have short bones. These are cube-shaped bones in the wrist or ankle. Sesamoid bones form within tendons like the patella located on the knee. And, of course, vary in size and number in different individuals as well. We also have the third category of flat bones. These are thin, flat, sometimes slightly curved. That's things like the sternum, the scapulae, the ribs, most of the bones in the skeleton, in the skull. And then, of course, we have irregular bones. Those are sort of complicated in shape. These are things like the vertebrae and the hip bones. So this classification is really important. So you can see these different shapes. Here is that long bone. So example is a humerus. We have flat bones, an example being the sternum. Irregular bones, you can see that such as the vertebra in the vertebral column. This, of course, is a lateral view of it. And then, of course, short bones. And so those are how we can categorize those based on shape. Bones basically are organs because they do contain different types of tissue. So sometimes we forget that bones serve as an organ system. So bone or osteotissue is the predominant type of tissue that's there. But bone also has nerve tissue, cartilage, fibrous connective tissue, muscle cells, epithelial cells, and its blood vessels. So there's a lot going on within the bone. So there's three levels of structure here: the gross anatomical level, the microscopic, and then the chemical level as well. So thinking of gross anatomy, basically the large, looking at the overall view, compact and spongy bone are some of the things we'll focus on within that. Compact bone, that dense outer layer that on every bone, it kind of appears smooth and solid. And then we have spongy bone, and it's kind of in the inside. It's made up of what looks like honeycomb, small needle-like or flat pieces of bone. We call these trabeculae. And there's open spaces of trabeculae, and they are filled with red or yellow bone marrow. So you can see out here, where my arrow is pointing, that is compact bone. It's smooth and solid. And then here you can see this spongy bone. It looks like a mesh of bony spines. Again, those are called trabeculae. And so you can kind of see what that inside of that bone actually looks like in its structure. Now, the structure of short, irregular, and flat bones, they tend to consist of thin plates of spongy bone, which is diplo, and is covered by that compact bone. And compact bone sandwiched between connective tissue membranes. We have something called the periosteum that covers the outside of compact bone, and endosteum covers the inside portion of compact bone. Bone marrow is scattered throughout the spongy bone. It's really got no defined marrow cavity, and haline cartilage covers the area of the bone that is part of a movable joint. So if there's a joint there, you're going to have some cartilage that covers it as well. Here's that flat bone image. You can kind of see here's that compact bone, and here's that flat, and here's a zoomed in image of that trabeculae. So you can kind of see what that looks like. The structure of a typical long bone, the long bones, they have a shaft. That shaft is called the diaphysis. I've heard people say it, let me see if I could say it. It's hard for me to say diaphysis. I say diaphysis. Some people say diaphysis. Either works. That's perfectly fine. Bone ends are the epiphyses or the epiphysis, and that's at the end of that. And then, of course, there's membranes. So the diaphysis is a tubular shaft that forms the long axis of the bone. It consists of compact bone surrounded by this medullary cavity, and it's filled with yellow marrow in adults. The epiphyses are the ends of the long bone. They have this compact bone externally and spongy bone internally. And of course, there's that articular cartilage that covers a joint. So where it joins, there's that cartilage that covers. So between the diaphysis and the epiphysis is the epithelial line. And that is the remnant of a childhood epithelial line, which is where bone growth occurs. Sorry, I hit the button that adjusts my screen. So basically, where bone growth occurs, you can see those epithelial plates. So the structure of a long bone, you can see this is the humerus, which is in the arm. You see these articular cartilage that forms at the joint, and you see the diaphysis, that is that long shaft that you see here, and the epiphyses are here on the end. So this is the proximal epiphyses, and this is the distal epiphyses. You see this medullary cavity, which is lined by endosteum, and then the periosteum there on the outside. And then you have this epiphyseal line. And of course, remember, that's basically the remnant of the childhood epiphyseal plate where bone growth actually occurs. And then, of course, you see that spongy growth there. So that's just the structure of that bone. So it's quite complex. When we zoom in on that, you see, of course, there's that compact bone here, and the spongy bone is here. You do see blood vessels that come through that as well, and some of that articular cartilage that is lining that area. So there are membranes associated with that. There's two types, the periosteum and the endosteum, which we've mentioned already. The periosteum is a white double-layered membrane that covers the external surfaces except for the joints. Its fibrous layer is an outer layer consisting of this dense, irregular connective tissue consisting of what we call Sharpie's fibers that secure to the bone matrix. There's this osteogenic layer. That basically is the inner layer of budding bone that contains this primitive osteogenic stem cells. And that's how we get more, gives rise to all of the bone cells. So as those bones are developing, the cells are coming from that osteogenic layer. There's lots of nerve fibers, there's lots of blood vessels that continue on to the shaft to basically through what we call the nutrient foramen opening so that we can get those nutrients through there. Of course, there's anchoring points as well for those tendons and ligaments. Endosteum, that's this delicate connective tissue membrane that covers the internal bone surface. It covers the trabeculae, a spongy bone. It lines the canals that pass through the compact bone. And like the periosteum, it contains these osteogenic cells that can differentiate into other bone cells. So those osteogenic cells can become other bone cells to support that structure. Again, if you're kind of looking at that structure, this is the humerus of the arm, that long bone. You can see that endosteum here. This is the yellow bone marrow that lines that central canal. This, of course, right here is compact bone. We'll talk about these little structures on that compact bone in a minute. They're called osteons, but we'll get to that pretty soon. Of course, this is that nutrient foramen that allows the nutrients to pass through. And so you can see all of that stuff that's structured there. Here is the periosteum, too. You can see that lining that's there. So a lot of complex material and makeup of that bone structure. The hematopoietic tissue in bones, we can think of red bone marrow, which is found in these trabecular cavities of spongy bone and the dipole of that flat bone, such as the sternum. In newborns, they have these medullary cavities, and all the spongy bone contains red marrow. In adults, the red marrow is located in the heads of the femur and the humerus, but most active area of hematopoiesis are flat bone, diplo, and some irregular bones, such as the hip bone. Yellow marrow can convert to red if a person becomes anemic. So that's sort of a protective mechanism there. There's also an important feature called bone markings, which are very important. Bone markings, of course, are things like tuberosity is one where you could see large rounded projection that may be roughened. Also, there's a crest, which is narrow ridges of bones. the trochanters, which are very large, blunt, irregularly shaped processes. So you can kind of see each one of these different types of bone markings. You can see them on bone. And these are really important to help us categorize bones, see what's going on with the bones. These things are looked for if there's damage or, if there's any development that is happening, being stunted or something like that. We should see these bone markings. These are some more bone markings categorized by either surfaces to form joints or with depressions and openings. So things like grooves, which are in furrows, and fissures, which are narrow, kind of like slit-like openings. The foramen, which are round, oval openings through a bone. Notches, which are indentations at the edge of a structure. Things like that. So lots of different bone markings that we can rely on to see there. When we're looking at the microscopic anatomy of bone, those are sort of the cells of the bone tissue. There's really 5 major cell types, each which is specialized from some basic cell type. We have the osteogenic cells, we have the osteoblasts, the osteocytes, the bone lining cells, and the osteoclasts. So just to compare some of these, this is what we call an osteoprogenitor cell. It's a stem cell. This osteoprogenitor cell can become different types of cells in that bone. So basically, this is a bone lineage cell. It can become an osteoblast. Osteoblast is responsible for bone growth. It helps build bone. It's matrix synthesizing cell. It replaces our bone. So as bone cells die off, you get more osteoblasts to help replace that bone. The osteoblast can become an osteocyte. That's a mature bone cell, and it monitors and maintains the mineralized bone matrix. You can also have osteoclasts. These are bone reabsorbing cells. It kind of breaks down bone. This is an osteoclast. You see the bone matrix here. This is the osteocyte within a lacuna and some nuclei associated with that cell. So my compact bone is also called lamellar bone, and it consists of, and you heard me say the word osteon just a minute ago. It's called the Haversian system, but the osteon is really important in those bone structures, and we'll talk about that. It contains canals and caniculi and interstitial and circumferential lamellae. So the osteon is just a structural unit of that compact bone. It consists of an elongated cylinder that runs parallel to the long axis of the bone, and it acts as these little tiny weight-bearing pillars. An osteon cylinder consists of several rings of bone matrix, and we call these lamellae. Lamellae contain collagen fibers that run in different directions in adjacent rings. It helps withstand stress and resist twisting, and the bone salts are found between these collagen fibers. So this is kind of a single osteon looking at it from the long view. And so you see these capillaries and arteries and all this stuff running through, and nerve fibers running through that osteon down the middle. And you see the lamellae that's sort of circling around it. It helps resist that twisting force that could happen there. The canals and the caniculi, the central canal or the Haversian runs through the core of the osteon, and it contains, like we saw in the last image, the blood vessels and the nerve fibers. And then we also have perforating canals, which we call Volkmann's canals. And these canals are lined with basically endosteum that occur at right angles of the central canal, and this connects the blood vessels and nerves of the periosteum, medullary cavity, and the central canal. And so here's that microscopic anatomy of that compact bone. We've seen this long view here, and basically have looked at it in that last image we saw. But this is that osteon, a little round central canal with that osteon surrounding it. So when you look at it face on that compact bone, and you see those layers that are there, and then, of course, some lamellae that surrounds that, and the lacunae that's there. Under a microscope, this is what bone looks like. It's very distinctive from all the other tissues. because it's this darkened color and you see this little round structure. Flat bones, of course, consist of a layer of spongy bone sandwiched between two thin layers of compact bone. We've seen this image before, but you can see what that structure of that flat bone looks like. The chemical composition of bone, of course, it's made of organic and inorganic compounds. The organic components can include, of course, those osteogenic cells, osteoblasts, osteocytes, bone lining cells, osteoclasts, osteoids. We haven't mentioned the osteoid much, but osteoids make up 1/3 of the organic bone matrix. It's secreted by osteoblasts. Basically contains ground substance and collagen fibers, and that contributes to that high tensile strength and flexibility of bone. The organic components still consist of these what we call sacrificial bonds. That helps with the resilience of bone. And basically it's in or between the collagen molecules, and they can stretch and break and to dissipate energy to prevent fractures. It can kind of spread that out so we don't have this big break. If no additional trauma occurs, those bonds can reform quite easily. Organic components, we have things, these hydroxyapatites. Basically, these are mineral salts. It basically makes up about 65% of bone mass and consists mainly of these little tiny calcium phosphate crystals in and around collagen fibers. And they're responsible for the hardness and the resistance to compression. And then we have ossification with regards to bone development, osteogenesis. This is the process of bone tissue formation. So basically, formation of the bony skeleton begins with about 2 months of development. Postnatal bone growth occurs until early adulthood, so bone remodeling and repair are lifelong, however. So when you're young, you have more new bone being made than bone breaking down. But as you get older, you have more bone breaking down than you have bone making. And so that's why you have things in older age and late years, such as osteoporosis and things like that. So you can see this is the endochondral ossification of long bone. You can see starting at week 9 all the way through birth and childhood to adolescence. So you see at the very beginning of this chapter, we said that bone is just this cartilage that's formed. And over development, you start getting this cartilage matrix being formed with blood vessels and some spongy bone formation. And then, of course, what happens is you start seeing this bone actually develop. We mentioned that epithelial line as development happens, and you can see those as the bone grows. So you can see that growth of bone and development happens all the way through adolescence. There's some intermembranous ossification as well, so you can see that there's some mesenchymal cells, these little collagen fibers, and what you can see is that ossification happens. You start seeing the cells kind of combine and working together. You start developing these osteoclasts. They differentiate, I should say, into these osteoclasts. You start seeing bone matrix being calcified. It becomes innervated, and blood supplies come to it, and you have this development of that bone. This is growth in the length of a long bone that occurs at the epithelial plate. So remember those plates that you see? This is an X-ray image of the right knee anterior view. Basically, you see that plate that's being formed. You see this proliferation zone that's here, the resting zone that's here, and this hypertonic zone, which you see older cartilage cells. They kind of enlarge as they're older, and then some calcification that actually occurs along that epithelial plate. Long bone growth and remodeling during youth. Of course, as it's remodeling, you can kind of see here's that epithelial plate, and you see this growth that occurs in this direction. So you see the outline of the bone before growth and remodeling, and then you see what it looks like after that growth has occurred. Another thing that we need to talk about in this chapter, and it's one of the last ones, the last topic that we'll talk about, is there's some common fractures. And so, of course, bones can break. They're extremely strong and flexible, but too much pressure or too much force can break them. We have different types of bone fractures that can occur. So these are some of those common types. We have these comminuted. These are bone fragments into 3 or more pieces, so you can kind of see what the breakage looks like. Particularly common in people who are aged and whose bones are more brittle. But it can occur at anyone. It's just more common in someone older. Compression, that's the bone is just crushed. This is common in porous bones, the osteoporotic bones that may be subjected to extreme trauma in a fall. You can see crushed vertebrae is a common one in which that happens. You can have a spiral fracture. That's a ragged break where there's some excessive twisting that is applied to the bone. These are common in sports fractures. And then we have these epiphyseal fractures. That's when the epiphyse separates from the long part of the bone, the diaphysis, along that epiphyseal plate. Basically, it tends to occur where cartilage cells are dying and calcification in the bone matrix is occurring. There's also depressed fractures. Broken bone is pressed inward. This is typical in a skull fracture when something is hit on the head or beaten about the head. You might have some kind of skull fracture there. There's also green stick, and this is where the bone breaks incompletely. You see sort of this kind of crack there. It's much in the way of how a green twig breaks. So only one side of the shaft breaks and the other side bends. And so you see that. That's common in children whose bones have relatively more matrix and are more flexible than those of adults. And, of course, we have these healing stages of bone. Basically, you get a hematoma that forms. You get this little bump that surrounds that broken bone. You can see this really well if you break a toe. You might have these little solid protrusions outside the toe, and you can see it, and it looks like it's swollen. It's because there's a hematoma there. And then you start getting this cartilaginous fiber. It forms a callus. Again, you can see that bump in where you have things like your toes or fingers. And, of course, new blood vessels start to form. As that happens, you get this callus that starts secreting that bone structure and still forms. And then you have this healed fracture. A lot of times that bump, that callus that forms from that hematoma and that replacing of the blood or the bone, you still see a little bit of a indentation there. Not as big as it was when you had the hematoma and that callus that was formed, but you see that there is a bump there, and it kind of remains, which you can tell if a bone's been fractured before because you can see that that's there. And then, of course, the last thing we'll talk about is bone disorders. There's lots of imbalances between bone deposit and bone reabsorption. And it underlies pretty much every disease that affects the human skeleton. So there's 3 main bone diseases: the osteomalacia and rickets, osteoporosis, and Paget's disease. Osteomalacia, the bones are just poorly mineralized and osteoid is produced, but calcium salts are not adequately deposited. This means that you get soft and weak bones and pain that happens if you try to bear weight. Rickets is basically the result of bowed legs, usually because of a vitamin D deficiency or insufficient dietary calcium. And so you can see here, this is osteoporosis and this bone that's weakened over time. It starts breaking down. This is normal bone. This is that osteoporotic bone. It gets weak, starts breaking down, and can break very easily. But please let me know if you have questions. I'm happy to help, so make sure you review all the material. And please reach out if you have any questions. I'm always happy to help. See you in the next chapter, and I hope you have a great day.